as we were saying before, we were in 1 Samuel chapter 7, and we had seen Samuel leading the people in a mighty way through the power of God, that the people had returned to God, that they were asking Samuel to intercede on their behalf, and that God had blessed them and had restored the ark to the people, that he had delivered them, and in many ways they weren't going to be at peace forever, but during the days of Samuel and his leadership, the Bible told us in 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 13 that the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. And so we can see that God was blessing the Israelites who had repented and returned to him, or to faith in him, I guess you would say. And the Philistines were now no longer going to be successful in subjugating them and mistreating them. As I've said before, Samuel, to me, the book is very much a book of opposites. It's like a roller coaster ride of good and bad. And so we're going to take another turn here in chapter 8. And so I encourage you to follow with me. We're going to pick up there and read the first 9 verses together of 1 Samuel chapter 8. So follow with me. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as judges for Israel. The name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second was Abijah, and they served at Beersheba. But his sons did not walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain, and accepted bribes and perverted justice. So all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. They said to him, "You are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." But when they said, "Give us a king to lead us," this displeased Samuel. So he prayed to the Lord. And the Lord told him, "Listen to all that the people are saying to you. It is not you they have rejected, but they have rejected me as their king, as they had done from the day I brought them up out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly, and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." And so we're going to pause there, because a little bit to kind of look at. As I said, it kind of takes a turn again, and some of you that have been with us for a few weeks and months may already begin to see some parallels in this story to some of the things we've talked about. I don't know if that struck you as we were reading this, but Samuel's struggle with his sons in their service reminds me very much of Eli's struggle with his sons in their service, right? If you remember back just a few weeks ago, we spoke about the fact that Eli's sons were absolutely despising their responsibility. They were taking advantage of their responsibility as priests, and we noticed specifically how they were doing that in violation of the law of Moses. And I think it's very challenging because, as we spoke about, you see Eli, who was a man of faith, but had great difficulty in corralling, I guess you would say, his sons. And we're seeing that same thing happen for Samuel, right? I don't think it's a stretch to say, based on the description in chapter 7 and the descriptions in the earlier chapters of this book, that Samuel was a man of faith and was pretty consistent in that. I'm sure he had his moments, his mistakes, just as any of us would, but the trajectory of his life was one of faith, right? That he walked with God and was a faithful man. But his sons were not those same folks, right? The people were not happy. I was sort of thinking about this. We don't see in Eli's case, going back, that the people were in an outcry over the behavior of their sons in quite the same way, right? They were upset. I think the Bible is clear about that they knew they were being mistreated. But I imagine for folks, they had experienced this under Eli's sons, and then Samuel came, and I'm sure that was so refreshing to see Samuel come in and his family, or I should say him, but then his family now, his sons. Well, we've done this before, right? We've played this game before, and this time they've kind of had it, right? Before they've complained, now we're taking it to the point of saying, we're done with their leadership, right? And they come and they ask Samuel for a king. Now, there are many reasons why they could have done this, but I think the scriptures are pretty plain. And as with so many things, the rationale is very poor, right? If they had come and said, hey, appoint us a new leader, appoint us new priests, appoint us a king even, because we need someone who's going to walk in the pathways of God and lead us faithfully. Okay, that might be one argument. I don't know how God might have received that, right? It's hard for us to say because it didn't happen that way. What they do say is, in verse number 5, they say, appoint for us a king such as all the nations have, right? Now, this is a problematic thing for them to be wishing for desiring for. I wish they had just stopped and said, hey, your sons are not walking in your ways. We need a new leader, right? We might have been okay, maybe. I don't know. But they begin to reveal, I think, the true intent of their heart, which was they wanted to look like the rest, right? They wanted to be as the other nations were when God had called them out of that, right? The fact is God had set them apart as a holy nation, as a nation that he had chosen, if you will, and they were for a special purpose. Now, we know ultimately that special purpose was to bring ultimately the Messiah for all of us, right? We know that there was a long game going on. That was the intent all along. But I think in this moment, their desire to be as other nations were blinded them to the fact that their uniqueness was the blessing, because their uniqueness was found in their God, in the God that we know. And so it's a shame that was the idea, but that was the way that they were looking at it. Now, what's interesting, if you wanted to go back to Deuteronomy, I'm going to do it just briefly. I won't read the whole passage for you. Is up until this point, Israel has not had a king, right? They've had leaders. Most recently, we've talked about the judges. Prior to that, they were led by individuals selected by God, such as Moses and Joshua. But all of these years before, in Deuteronomy chapter 17, God predicted that this was all going to happen. So back in the days of Moses, God knew that ultimately they would ask for a king. And I want to take you back for a moment because it is astounding to me that it happens as it does, right? In verse 14 of Deuteronomy 17, the Bible tells us, when you enter the land of the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it, and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Like he knew exactly what was going to happen, And I think it's amazing, like if you can kind of wrap your head around it, I was struggling a little bit, is knowing full well that their hearts were going to take them in that direction. He went ahead and included instructions on how to select this individual, on who to consider and what their, I guess you would say, qualifications should be. And so here's what the verses tell us. Be sure to appoint, this is verse 15, be sure to appoint over you the king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your own brothers. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not a brother Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them, for the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver and gold. When he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law, taken from that of the priests who are Levites. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord his God, and follow carefully all the words of this law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his brothers, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Now, even as I read that, I imagine some of you are starting to make connections to things that are coming where, yes, they get the first one right, at least initially, right? We're going to go with the one God chooses. But it's really just a matter of time before we begin to violate almost all those other qualifications that God laid before them, right? As we were speaking about, the marriage of the wives, I imagine some of you immediately started to go to folks like Solomon, right? Who probably is the poster boy of doing it the wrong way, right? Not only that, ironically, he talks about going back to Egypt. He married the princess of Egypt, so there you go. So that's not that weird, considering. So, here we go. We're doing all these things. Now, in defense of Solomon, I've always said he learned about the multiple wives things from his daddy, because his daddy had a bunch of wives. Not nearly so many, not that many, but by my count, more than one. and I would have always thought that Solomon, growing up in that palace, seeing all of the sibling rivalry that came up as a result of who was, brother and sister and all that kind of stuff, might have thought better of all of that. But no, okay? And we can't argue, I think, in any way that Solomon didn't accrue for himself by that point much wealth. But that was coming even from the days of Saul and David, right? And so it's really only just a few kings in before we see that. I see about the law there, about keeping the law. I'm reminded of the story of Josiah as they come out of the temple as they're repairing things, and they say, hey, look, we found this book. It's the book of the law. And Josiah hears it read aloud, and he can't believe it because they're completely not practicing those things. And so he begins what is, at that point in history, one of the greatest revivals of I guess you would say, the faith of the Israelites in the history of the kingdom, right? Josiah's reforms were kind of unmatched in terms of returning to God. But they had lost the law. The very book that the king was supposed to keep on hand, and I think we see in Josiah a king that had a heart for God, that when they finally found out about all of this, he absolutely returned to it. But it's scary to think they had lost it over the years, right? And so I share with you, so God knew that this was going to happen, and God laid out rules and conditions, but it speaks to the brokenness, I think, of our own desires and the brokenness of our ability to lead ourselves well outside of the leadership of God. Now, I see in this the faithful heart of Samuel, going back to 1 Samuel 8 now. When we see Samuel, he is genuinely troubled by this. I love that his first response is to take it to God, right? He hears this troubling news and he goes to God. I imagine, that he felt some spirit of being rejected, right? Because while it doesn't say that he felt that way, God reassures him in that way. And God knows his heart, right? That they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me as king, right? And so I'm sure that Samuel was experiencing some personal rejection in that moment. And I imagine some sense of shame because it was his sons that they were really troubled by. What's interesting to me is this may be one thing if they're inquiring about a king later on, but as I talked about with Samuel kind of taking this personally, like he's still alive and he's still judging Israel, right? In many ways, I could see him saying, well, wait a minute, like you're upset about my replacement. I've not been replaced yet. I'm still here, I'm not dead, what's going on? And so I'm sure that was troubling as well. But I think God speaks to the truth of all these things, and it's something that is true even until now for us, perhaps in our own context. But God was the rightful king, right? He always was. He wasn't their earthly king, but he was their rightful king. He's the one that they should have been following after. What is revealed here is that Israel and generally people were never going to be satisfied with this. So God is going to grant their request, but he's going to tell Samuel to warn them. And we're going to take a few minutes to look at a little bit of that. But when it comes to Samuel, he is going to lay out for them really a tragic story of how things are going to go with a king. I know we talk here about the fact of desiring to conform, and I think that's this idea here that we want to not stand out, we want to be a part of the group. Why is that a temptation for us? I mean, it was a temptation for the Israelites to want to be like the other nations. Why is it a temptation for us, even in amidst our nation, to want to be, part of it and to not have to stand out? What's the temptation there for us? Why does that happen?
Become like the world.
Yeah.
God calls us out of that.
Absolutely.
So we're supposed to be different. Supposed to look different. Supposed to talk different. Act different. Make different decisions.
Yeah. Well, and that's it. Is that we're called out of the world, right? But I think so often we enjoy the idea of being like, right? And so rather than, I guess you would say, adopting the uniqueness, and I want to be clear, right? We're not called to peculiarity, as the scripture tells us. We're not called to uniqueness for the sake of being weird, right? Like, that's not, because, I've met some folks that were just kind of weird. I think we're called to a spirit of relatability, a heart of compassion. A lot of these, again, it's very clear that we're to love people, right? And so I believe that's actually the peculiarity, right? That we're called into a love that's just bizarre to people, right? To a spirit of forgiveness that's bizarre to people, right? And to some of these sort of things, a spirit of generosity that's bizarre to people. And so I think as we adopt those characteristics of Jesus, that will make us different. I was listening to a preacher the other day, and he was saying, that when you look at the ministry of Jesus, how attractive it was to people. But it wasn't attractive to those that were in the authority. They weren't, the ones that saw him as a threat to their power. They were the ones that were quick to condemn. But for everyone who had a rough life, check the box on everybody, right? For everybody who was down on their luck, for everybody who felt like they'd been rejected by culture, all these different things, they found in Jesus someone who was willing to love and to work with them and to have compassion on them and to heal them and do all those things. And I think that's the uniqueness there. Man, it's sometimes it's not fun to stand out, right? I remember as a kid particularly, but even as an adult, I'm gonna be honest with you, there's still that I don't really want to be seen in the crowd. Like it's kind of nice to get lost in the crowd. I don't know how you feel about some of those things. We've been blessed to travel a good bit, and one of the things that I like to do is I like to go to sporting events, and if I can find the excuse to travel to a sporting event, then that's always a good time. But I love in those moments when you're at a ball game or even a concert or something like that, and you look around, there's thousands of people, maybe even just hundreds, but it's a big crowd, and you can't really pick anybody out, right? There's sort of that, and hopefully we're all behaving ourselves, and so it doesn't really matter if we're part of that crowd or not, like unless we're just rooting for the wrong team, because that's sinful. Kidding. But thank you for somebody laughing. They knew I was kidding. I appreciate it. But yeah, if you're cheering for the wrong team, we got to talk. There's good and there's evil. That's true. But the fact is you can kind of get lost in that crowd, and there's no big deal, right? But very easily we can find ourselves in the crowd that's also shouting "Crucify." You see what I'm getting at? We can find ourselves in these positions where we're part of that mob that's calling for all kinds of ungodly things if we're not careful. And I think sometimes the crowd can skew our view of what the truth is. Right? Yes, sir?
Sometimes we need to be in that position to really test our faith and see if we're going to stay with that crowd, if we actually stand out in the light of Christ.
Yeah.
So you need situations like that, I think, And I think it puts us in situations like that to test us, to see where we're at.
Well, and I think, the way you say, that sometimes, we have to test our faith. We have to make sure that, as Paul says it, that we are in the faith, right? And I think so often, I always want to caveat that by saying I think we need to be careful that we're not putting ourselves in bad situations unnecessarily. And so we need to kind of be careful there. But the reality is we still have to live in this world, right? The scriptures are pretty plain, in but not of, right? Which I know is a bit of a, sometimes we can mince that a little bit, but the idea is like we have to be able to live in our community. We have to be able to participate as what would you say, good citizens, and to be a part of these things in terms of, we're blessed with that. But we have to be able, I think, as well to okay, well, this is okay, but this is just not, and be able to parse that out and to call it out. And I think the other thing, as you were saying about that, is I think one of the things that's amazing to me is I used to kind of joke with the kids, like peer pressure works in reverse, right? I remember years ago, when I was living in Orlando, we'd gone on a young adult outing, which actually all of the girls canceled, so it was just a young men's outing. So I guess whatever. But it was, I think it was like 8 or 9 of us that were all in our 20s from church, and like a couple of guys that weren't. And I remember, there was a moment where one of the guys that really wasn't, we went to Busch Gardens. I don't know if I said that part. So we went to Busch Gardens, and at one point, one of the guys swore really loud. And it wasn't one of the church members, I'm glad to say, but we all kind of stopped and went, and he's like, "Oh, I'm not bad, guys. I forgot where I was, and who I was with." But I think that it was kind of a beautiful moment because we just, we really didn't even have to say anything. We just kind of all paused and, nah, man, that's just not how we operate. And I think about those moments, and I think sometimes, like when we talk about surrounding ourselves, we've got to be cognizant of the fact that who we surround ourselves with shapes who we are, right? So if I spend the majority of my time around immoral people, I begin to be shaped by their immorality, right? And so it's part of why I know we were talking about this in the sermon, I guess a week ago, is you never go alone, right? If you're going to go into a situation, you never go alone. You always take your brother, your sister with you, and it's smart that way because it's very easy to be influenced by culture. Okay. Any comments or questions there? Looking at our time. Yes, ma'am.
I do, and I hesitate to ask it because it
Okay.
shows a lack of understanding on my part. And I think I just skimmed through this as I've read it through the years.
Sure.
But, so Israel's asking for a king. They come to Samuel and they say, "We don't want your sons to lead us, and we want a king." And what I'm failing to understand really is they're not going to be giving up synagogue worship like it is. Like the priests they're still going to be doing all of the sacrifices and all of those things. So now, and we've seen the judges are leading, and God has used the judges, and he uses them to fight against the other, the Philistines or the other. So what I'm wondering is, what are they actually like? All they're asking for is a king instead of a priest or a judge to lead them. Yeah. I don't know what, I guess I've always thought, well, it's almost like they're asking for one more person to lead them versus just, is it the separation of church and state? Is that where the rejection of God is? Like, I don't understand.
Yeah, I get you. Yeah. So, and I think the best way I think about it, because I think it's a good question, she was asking essentially like, so they're asking for a king. Is it really different than them having basically had judges? Like, what is the real difference, right? Because it's still an earthly leader, theoretically they're an Israelite, so wouldn't they still be in the faith, and wouldn't the priest still be doing the job?
And by God or the priest,
right?
I don't know.
Yeah, and I think the best way that I understand it, and I'll turn to the room then, is I think it was a statement about the fact that they didn't want the system that God had given them, and that's the way I kind of read it. When it comes to some of the things that they were doing, I was shocked the other day. I was reading a commentator, and they said that and again, to take this, you may want to go back and read it, because I was kind of shocked, is that much like this king situation, the temple was David's idea. And then basically came back and they said, no, we're not going to do that. And then God allowed it to happen, and God allowed himself to remain there. But they haven't had a temple. He'd been kind of content to live in the tabernacle. It was David says, oh, this is terrible. The Lord didn't live in a house, right? And so I think it's this idea like, well, where did he get the idea from temple from? Well, there's a temple of Dagon, there's a temple, right? All the surrounding nations had temples. Well, our God deserves a temple, right? But did our God need a temple, right? And again, we know from our faith today that God didn't need a temple, right? That he always intended to dwell in the hearts of his people, right? And so I think it's sort of that trapping of we want to be like everyone else. We want to look. We don't want to be peculiar. Like, it's not fun to be the ones that stand out. It's not fun to have this system that nobody understands and comprehends. Like, why can't we? And that's the best way I've read it. Jim, I saw your hand.
You can't discount the fact that there's a lot of people that have in their mind they need pomp and circumstance.
Yeah, absolutely.
And of course, a king is something that's really something special.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's a, hey, look at us thing, right? It becomes, which, again, they could have easily been like, hey, look at our God, right? Like, check out what he's done, which he had done a lot, and the nations around knew that, right? And, that's well documented, the fear and the trembling that came upon them in these situations. I mean, most recently, the Philistines with the whole tumors incident in chapter 6. You can look that one up. But 1 Samuel, that is. And so I've always read it as that. It was a statement about their hearts were moving a different direction. And because again, as I said before, I wonder if they had come before and said, hey, clearly these leaders aren't working out. Can we do something different leadership-wise? Because these men are not faithful. I think it would have been received differently, but I think they had to tag on like, but we want to be like everybody else. Yeah, and well, when that becomes our motive, it usually doesn't go well, right? So, but that's my best read. Are there any other comments or questions there? I think I've got 1 minute. I think we're going to not start reading the next passage because, again, 1 minute. But I will point out to you, again, in the latter part of chapter 8, he is going to, Samuel that is going to convey to the people all that is going to happen to the king, all of the unfortunate side effects of having a king. And he's going to lay that out. But then, as we'll find out next week, Lord willing, Samuel is going to follow God's directive, and he is going to anoint for them a king of his choosing. And some of you already know where we're going there. So we'll look forward to that. We're going to be introduced next week to Saul, and I hope you will be with us. Thank you so much for your time and your attention, and God bless. Grace and peace.